Hi everybody and welcome to today's class. We are going to be talking about diversity and disturbance today. So this is a topic that encompasses a whole series of ideas and it talks about the relationship between short-term disturbances and how that affects diversity. Okay, so I'm just going to start sharing the screen. Let's go to here. Okay, so by the end of this class you should be able to describe the relationship or relationships between diversity and disturbance. You should be able to analyse some real data and interpret its salient points to convey to a classmate the idea of what we call the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, or the IDH. Okay. Why is that not on? So the first thing we want to think about is, what is a disturbance? We might have an idea about what this is. We could give examples of it potentially, but can we come up with an all-encompassing sort of definition that includes all the important aspects? Well, somebody already has, and the definition that's often most used is an event or series of events that disrupts ecosystem, community, or population structure and changes resources or the physical environment. So you'll notice in that is a very all-encompassing definition. It's just saying that disturbance is something that happens that disrupts the ecosystem, community, or population structure, so that is the animals and plants, and potentially changes the resources. So, for example, it could affect availability to water, it could affect availability to soil, it could affect availability to sunlight, or the physical environment. It might change heat, it might change dryness, it might change slope, it could increase sort of steepness and things like that. So it's an all-encompassing definition that includes a whole series of different potential disturbances. So let's think of some examples. Well, one of the ones that we see an awful lot around here is wildfire. Wildfire, especially in sort of parts of Utah around here, further up north, further west, is a huge disturbance that's very, very prevalent in the western United States. Last year, during the fire season here in Logan, for those that weren't here, we had a whole series of fires in Logan Canyon. From our house, we could see the helicopter coming in to collect water out of First Dam to go and dump on the fires further up the canyon. It was caused by a campfire, as it usually is. And last year in California was the biggest fire season they'd ever seen. Same in Australia, same in parts of Europe, such as Greece and things like that. So wildfire is a huge deal, and it's especially common around here. It seriously affects our air quality, so we notice it, but it has massive implications for the landscape. One that we don't see quite so often around here is flooding. This image is what used to be one of my old field sites just outside of Sydney in Australia. So Australia has very, very strange river systems. Australia has no gigantic river like the Mississippi or the Amazon or the Congo because it's the flattest continent in the world. Instead, it has very sort of episodic rivers like the Murray-Darling Basin that Sydney sits in. It is often completely dry, and then other times massive, massive floods. So our cabins, where our field station used to be, was about here. This is part of what was the sort of the pavilion out front where we used to hang out. And basically, a section of the river completely burst its banks, pulled all this vegetation down, and pulled it through basically what used to be our field station. This is a place called Jerinjong, so it used to be called. So flooding is a huge deal. It uproots trees, changes the structure of riverbanks. It has huge implications as a disturbance because it affects biodiversity. Another one that we might not immediately think of because of where we are is this. Can anybody tell me, or just think about, you obviously can't tell me, but can anyone understand what this is an image of? It's taken from a helicopter, but what are we looking at? Just have a think for about 5 seconds. Okay, well, this is the aftermath of the Indonesian tsunami. This took place on New Year's Day, a good number of years ago now, But it was the biggest catastrophic event through tsunami that we've seen in a very long time. So what happened was, this is the flat land coming into the beach. Here are the mountains that are just across from the beach, and here is the ocean. A tsunami wave came on the ocean and completely leveled this entire area. So all of this area here used to be covered in trees and covered in buildings. Now you can see it's almost been completely stripped bare. There are a few absolutely hardcore trees that managed to hang on, but it got hammered. I mean, you can even see, here's a road along here. Here's the coastal road. These shapes here are the old where buildings used to sit. These were beachfront condos and things like that, and hotels. There's a pad from something. There's another part of a building. You can see still bits of the road. There's another little road coming through there. Looks like there's another road coming along this way. So you can see the destructive power for a tsunami is absolutely incredible. In coastal locations, these can be seriously bad. I mean, this one killed hundreds of thousands of people. And it's just completely leveled everything on the run-up. As I say, all of this used to be covered in the same trees as this. It used to look like that. So as a result, tsunami has really serious implications for coastal ecosystems. One of the other ones a little bit closer to home is this. Some people, especially those from Washington State, might recognize some of these images. This is the eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington State. So Mount St. Helens used to look like this. It is a volcano. There was a massive sort of weird eruption. This is what it looked like when it blew up. And it sent enormous plumes of ash up into the air. And the entire side of the volcano came off. This is now what it looks like. You can see it's got a crater. This is what it used to look like. That's what it now looks like. The ash plume destroyed all the forests for miles and miles around. This is now what the forests have looked like. Those of you that have ever been to Washington State or Oregon or Northern California know that it's incredibly lush, large forests, incredibly green, very, very fertile. This is what it looked like for a long time afterwards. All the ash from this explosion destroyed everything. So it's a huge deal. One of the other disturbances is invasive species. So we've got two of them here. This invasive species is the zebra mussel. This has had a massively negative impact on the Great Lakes. It's also infected some of the lakes and water bodies around here in Utah. So this is, if you ever take a boat from here in Logan up into Idaho, you get stopped and they want to do a watercraft inspection. They also do it on the way to Bear Lake. They are looking for evidence of these zebra mussels predominantly, because they really don't want these zebra mussels getting into Bear Lake or any of the water bodies. Because when they get in, they have a massively negative impact on other species. This little beastie in the background on the main picture is a cane toad. Cane toad we're going to talk about a little bit in the invasive species lecture that we do. But the cane toad is one of the worst invaders in Australia. Australia's got the second worst invasive species problem in the world. The first is New Zealand. And one of the really nasty ones is this thing called the cane toad. Cane toads are big. They get to something about the size of the really, really massive ones can get to about the size of a dinner plate. They get enormous. And they're absolutely voracious and they're poisonous. And they are having a really bad impact on Australian wildlife. So these invasive species, they come in, they disturb the ecosystems, they change the population, community structure. As a result, they can be considered a disturbance. Okay? So examples of disturbance are things like fires, floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, landslides, and invasions of new species. There can be others, but these are just some of the basic ones to highlight as examples. Now what we need to think about is, well, is disturbance always detrimental to biodiversity? So just take a second and predict how diversity will respond to a disturbance. Think in both ecological and evolutionary terms. Just work through it in your head, or do it for only about sort of 15-20 seconds. Think about how diversity will react following a disturbance. And start now. Okay. Well, the first question we want to ask ourselves is disturbance always bad for biodiversity in every occasion? We can think it might be bad to begin with, but it's not absolutely always bad. And there's a reason for this. Because without disturbance, so in the absence of disturbance, we can get species becoming what we call competitive dominance. And this is a species that outcompetes all other species for a resource, therefore excluding a whole bunch of other species. And an example of that is something like in waterways is curled-leaved pondweed. So if curled-leaved pondweed gets into a waterway, even in its native range, it can form these enormous mats. It dominates the entire ecosystem. And in the formation of these mats, it blocks out sunlight for other plants that might try and grow. And as a result, it takes all the sunlight and the other plants die off. So if there's no disturbance, if this plant is just allowed to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow, it becomes a competitive dominant and it excludes other plants from existing in the ecosystem. Okay, so without disturbance, we can get a thing called a competitive dominant. So, just as a fake clicker question, what will happen to biodiversity when a competitive dominant arrives in an ecosystem? A, biodiversity will decrease as the dominant species excludes others. B, the competitive dominant is a new species, so it will add to biodiversity. Or C, biodiversity will stay the same. Just do 10 seconds on this. Okay, well, the correct answer is A. So when a competitive dominant is present in an ecosystem, biodiversity will decrease as that dominant species excludes others. However, a disturbance may reduce the abundance of a competitive dominant. So here you see we talked about this wildfire. So we've got wildfire burning down all these trees. Yeah, it's bad in the immediate term. But in the weeks and months post the fire, you can have forests that look like this. So yes, we've still got the trees, and the vast majority of them, a lot of them did get killed, there's no two ways about it. But look at the understory. So we've now got, because we've got sunlight coming in, because these trees, which were acting a bit as competitive dominants, were blocking out all the sunlight. That's no longer happening. Sunlight can penetrate all the way down to the understory, and we end up with this huge diversity of plants growing in what was the forest. As the forest recovers, it will increase with shade, and these plants will again be shaded out, and we'll get the competitive dominant situation again. But immediately after disturbance, we have very high diversity of understory plants. This is shown in multiple ways. One of the ways is with beetle-killed forests. So this is the mountain pine beetle. It's absolutely decimating forests in British Columbia, Washington State, Oregon, and now parts of Alberta. What happens when you get this beetle coming in? Well, it's an interesting one because this beetle is a native species. It's always present. Normally, in the winter, the cold kills off the vast majority of its population. So as a result, its population is massively suppressed by the cold winters. Then during the spring and summer, the populations start to build again. However, what's happening now is that because the winters aren't so cold, the beetle isn't being killed off, and so it's remaining at a very high population all the time. And what it's doing is it's destroying these forests. So this is a scene of a forest in British Columbia, Canada. The green is living tree. The brown is trees that are in the process of being killed by being overconsumed by this beetle. And the black areas are completely dead forest that have now keeled over. Okay, so this beetle, it can get in and it moves in a wave. Here's the healthy forest, dead and then destroyed. But what happens to the overall diversity of the ecosystem when this happens? So on this graph, remember how we work through graphs? What sort of graph is it? Well, it's a scatter plot and a line graph. Then we look at the axes. On the x-axis we have percent tree mortality. This is beetle-killed trees, from no trees killed to 100% of trees killed. And on the y-axis we have our Shannon-Weiner Diversity Index. Remember, the Shannon-Weiner Diversity Index is an index that takes into account both the species richness and the evenness. And what do we see? Well, as we increase the amount of trees killed, so bearing in mind this is an increasing amount of disturbance, so increase the amount of trees killed, we actually see increased diversity for a long time. We then hit a peak and it looks like it starts to decay. But generally, for a large amount of disturbance, we see this increase in disturbance is an increase in diversity because these trees are acting as a competitive dominant. So by being killed off by the beetle, they're allowing other species to start to grow. Okay? And this gets us on to the beginning of something called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. And before we get into the intermediate disturbance hypothesis too deeply, just wanted to highlight a couple of things. And that is that although we're talking about how diversity can impact, disturbance can impact diversity, and specifically that in some cases disturbance might be good for diversity, we must remember that the most diverse places on the planet, which are coral reefs and tropical rainforests, are also the least disturbed places on the planet. So while we can have this situation where a bit of disturbance can be good for diversity, over the huge long term, and remember we talked about things like the museum hypothesis and the area hypothesis in terms of determining global biodiversity, but the most diverse places in the world are also the least disturbed. So just keep that in mind. I don't want to always hark on that disturbance is always good, because it's not necessarily. But there is this principle called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis that shows a relationship between disturbance and diversity. So the idea behind the intermediate disturbance hypothesis was that Joseph Connell, in 1978, he suggested that diversity should be greatest at intermediate levels of disturbance. So at these intermediate levels of disturbance, that means a variety of species have colonized, but competitive exclusion, so the rise of a competitive dominant, has not taken place. So sort of visually, this is what it looked like. So here we have an arrow of increasing stability or reduced disturbance. So when we've got very unstable, such as on the side of a volcano, only stress-tolerant or rapid colonizing species can survive. When we go up here and we have very little disturbance, we end up with a competitive dominant that ends up excluding everything else. So Joseph suspected, well, there might be a sweet spot in the middle, where you've not got too much disturbance that it excludes a lot of species, and you've not got competitive dominance taking over so that species are getting excluded. So this was the basic idea, that somewhere in the middle is this sweet spot where there's just enough disturbance to reduce competitive dominance, but not so much disturbance that it ends up killing lots of species because it's too stressful. So let's have a look. So we came up with that in 1978. In 1979, the first real experimental data to test the intermediate disturbance hypothesis was carried out. So this was done by Sousa, and we have basically in streams in New Zealand had this great idea where he went and he measured the number of species, on different sorts of boulders. So he looked at small rocks, medium rocks, and big rocks. The idea was this is all in the same stream, but because it's a stream and the water is moving, that the moving water has the ability to actually move the rocks. So small rocks, because they're small, are very easy to move. So in the stream, and a load of water comes down, it will move a whole bunch of the small rocks very, very easily. The medium rocks can be moved sometimes. They can be moved when you have a big flood, but they're not going to move all the time like the small rocks. The big rocks are so big they just can't be moved by the stream. So as a result, you have three basic levels. You have small rocks, which get disturbed or moved a lot, medium rocks, which get disturbed or moved a bit, and big rocks, which get disturbed or moved never. So you have this disturbance gradient of high disturbance and low disturbance with an intermediate. Now remember, these are all in the same stream, so as a result, there's no between stream differences in number of species. But what do we find? Well, for small rocks, we see that the vast majority of them have only one species on them, just the one. Some small rocks have two, few have three, and very few have four species. Then if we have a look at medium rocks, we see for medium rocks, there are no medium rocks that only have one species on them, none at all. The most common number of species to have on medium rocks is 2 or 4, bearing in mind 4 was the maximum for small rocks, and there's a lot of rocks that have 5, 6 or 7 species on them. If we go to big rocks, we see again, we've got some big rocks, a lot of big rocks have only one species. The most common is 2, we get some 3, 4, 5, 6 and no 7. So, we can ask ourselves, for each level of disturbance, do boulders have the same number of species? Well, no. On small rocks, we never saw a small rock with 5 or more species on. We never saw a big rock with 7 species on. We never saw a medium rock with only 1 species on. So if we can ask ourselves, if one diversity value, 1 to 7, is most frequent, well, why is that? Well, on small rocks, we've got a lot of rocks with only 1 species. This 1 species is probably a very stress-tolerant species that can cope with the rocks continuously being moved. Because as the rocks are moved, they sort of grind against each other and they can crush things and be bad. Okay. So is there a pattern in algal diversity amongst the 3 level of disturbance? If so, is there directionality? Well, there is a pattern because we've got lowest diversity, medium diversity, highest diversity. So do these results follow the intermediate disturbance hypothesis? Well, yes. We have the highest level of diversity at intermediate levels of disturbance, with the lowest diversity at high disturbance and lower diversity than the highest at low disturbance. So as a result, yeah, highest in the middle, lowest at the ends. Classic intermediate disturbance hypothesis. There was other observational data to test the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. This was conducted by Jane Lubchenco in 1978 as part of her PhD thesis. For those of you who've never heard the name Jane Lubchenco before, she is an absolutely incredible scientist. She was the chief scientific advisor to Barack Obama during his presidency. She's also been the chief scientist for Ecological Society of America. She's generally a very, very amazing person. So if you get a few minutes, well worth just looking up her biography and her time. She's also given a seminar here at Utah State, so she's a great person to get to know. So she conducted this experiment as part of her PhD, where she was looking at in tide pools. Remember, H is our Shannon-Weiner diversity index, and on the x-axis she's looking at snail density. So snails could potentially be a disturbance because they eat algae and seaweed. So as a result, increased snails might mean increased disturbance because things are getting eaten an awful lot. And what Jane did is she conducted an experiment where she looked in tide pools and also the rock surface and looked at whether or not there was evidence for the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So what type of graph are we looking at? Well, we've got our dots and we've got our lines. We're looking at a scatter plot and line graph. Our x-axis is snail density, and our y-axis, well, on this side, this is the Shannon-Weiner diversity index, and this side is S, so just species richness. Shannon-Weiner diversity index is with the solid circles. Species richness is with the open circles. You can see they both follow the same pattern, which is nice. So, for each habitat type, we can ask, is there a trend in algal diversity with increasing snail density? Well, there is a trend. So when we're looking at tide pools, snail density goes up from left to right. We see first diversity goes up and then it goes down. Very strong pattern. If we look at the rock surfaces, we can see snail density goes up, diversity just goes down. So, do the patterns between the two diversity indices differ? Well, no, because the Shannon-Weiner diversity and the species richness both follow the same pattern in both cases. Shannon-Weiner species, the solid dots and the open dots are following the same pattern. So, how do the patterns and diversity compare between the two habitats? Well, we've obviously got a difference because in tide pools we have this hump-shaped with the highest diversity in the middle, and the rock surfaces we have a straight descending line with the highest diversity where there's no snails. So do these results follow the intermediate disturbance hypothesis? Well, let's do it as a fake clicker question. So, answer A is neither graph shows evidence for the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. B, both graphs show evidence for the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. C, there's evidence for the intermediate disturbance hypothesis in tide pools but not on the rock surface. D, there's evidence for the intermediate disturbance hypothesis on the rock surface but not on tide pools. Okay, just give you 10 seconds on that. Okay, well, in this case the correct answer is C. We do have evidence for the intermediate disturbance hypothesis in tide pools but not on the rock surface. In the tide pools we've got lowest diversity when there's no snails, low diversity when we've got lots of snails because we've probably eaten everything, but in the middle we have the highest diversity. This is probably because here the snails are eating enough algae that they're reducing competitive dominance, but not so much algae that they're killing everything. Compare that to the rock surface. Well, highest diversity with no snails, lowest diversity as we get more snails, so it's just a decay. So no, there's no evidence for it. Okay. Also, we can have the post-disturbance recovery can actually go through a form of the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So here we have a scatter plot of, on the x-axis we have time since fire in years, and on the y-axis we have lichen species richness. Okay, and what we see is that immediately after a fire we see low richness in lichen. It then goes up as the lichen starts to colonize and grow, but then it goes back down at by about 50 years as some lichen outcompetes the others. So this is recovery after a disturbance, and it goes through what we call temporally, so through time, it goes through the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. Okay? So remember, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, the main assumption of it is that species face a trade-off between competitive ability and ability to persist through or recover from disturbance. So there are some species that are like, okay, I'm just going to be a really good stress tolerant. I can deal with stress, I can deal with disturbance, that's great. But if you are that sort of species, you're not very good at competing by and large because you're investing all your resources in the ability to tolerate stress. That means if there is no stress, a species that's a better competitor than you can knock you out. Okay? So the main assumption behind it is this idea that species face a trade-off between competitive ability and ability to persist through or recover from disturbance. Okay? And we do see that trade-off, to be honest, in a lot of species. So one of the examples that we see around here is that relationship between aspen and Engelmann spruce. So aspen trees, they grow well in areas of full sunlight, say immediately after a fire, but they are intolerant of shade. They cannot cope with shade. Compared to that Engelmann spruce, they're susceptible to fire, they burn very well, but they shade out aspen over time. So as they grow, they can outgrow aspen, shade out aspen, and end up killing them. So what we see is, if we have a gradient of disturbance from low to high, at high disturbance, only the tolerant species persist, only like the aspen that are good at growing after fire. At low disturbance, only the strongest competitors exist, so we only get the spruce. In the middle, we get both. We get both the tolerant and the competitive species exist because the tolerant species can establish. The competitive species can also establish because not too much disturbance, but there is enough disturbance that it doesn't allow the competitive species to knock out the uncompetitive species. And the intermediate disturbance hypothesis has been proposed as one of the potential reasons why the high diversity of plants along the rivers in Logan Canyon. So this is the Logan River. Where's my thing gone? Here's the Logan River. And what we call the riparian vegetation, so that's the vegetation that grows on the side of rivers. This riparian vegetation in Logan Canyon is very diverse. One of the reasons for this might be, well, in the spring we get these massive spring floods and we get the peak, what we call the peak spring runoff going down Logan Canyon. During this time, it's a big disturbance and it can knock out plant species, but it only happens once a year. So after this big enormous flood, the plant species got an entire year to regrow, but that year is not so long that we can get competitive dominance. Okay? Righty, now let's talk a bit about people. Well, we as humans tend to be competitive dominants. So this, for example, this image here is Manhattan Island in New York. As you can see, Manhattan Island historically used to be an incredibly biodiverse place. It's an island right on the ocean, lots and lots of sunlight, lots and lots of rain. It's a perfect place for plants to grow. But nowadays, it is dominated by people. It is one of the most human-dominated landscapes in the world. There's a little bit of these trees down here that are sort of a little park, but by and large, the entirety of Manhattan Island is just concrete and glass and steel, with the exception of probably Central Park's around it somewhere. But we've dominated that entire landscape. We are now the dominant species on it by a long way. Same, but to a lesser extent, in other cities. So this is Sydney. I actually took this picture from the far side of Sydney, so that's the Opera House, and there's the Harbour Bridge when we lived there. Sydney, again, it's a big, huge coastal city. Humans are by far the dominant species on that landscape, but the area around Sydney used to be incredibly fertile. It's got mangroves, it's got all sorts of trees and things like that. So, let's think about we are competitive dominant. So what happens when a disturbance removes humans from an area? So is it A, biodiversity will increase as the dominant human species used to exclude others? B, is it biodiversity will decrease as the humans provided resources for other species? C, biodiversity will stay the same? Or D, has never happened, so we've got no way to tell? Just give you 10 seconds on this. Actually, I'll give you 20 seconds because it's a slightly harder one. Okay, so the answer is biodiversity will increase as the dominant human species used to exclude all others. Now, there are some absolutely fantastic examples of this from all over the world. So one of the really cool ones is the reclamation of Mayan cities. So this is a Mayan temple in Belize. You can see it's this gigantic pyramid, and you can see it's been reclaimed by the forest in Belize. So people were still finding these sort of Mayan temples and things like that up until relatively recently, because with the story of the European colonization of South America, as per usual, was unfortunately a bit sad. But when the conquistadors and the Spanish first arrived in South America, they brought smallpox with them. That smallpox eradicated large numbers of people that were the indigenous peoples, so the Incas and the Mayans of South America. These cultures had actually established high-functioning, high-density cities all through South America. South America is incredibly fertile. I mean, you can see how green this is. So as these fertile landscape could support very, very large populations of people, those people cleared the forest, they used it for agriculture and other things. When smallpox came through, It completely wiped out entire cities. The cities had to be abandoned because the last place you want to be during a massive disease epidemic is a high density city. And over time, this highly fertile rainforest has reclaimed these cities. So although this temple, you can still see, sits in the rainforest, you can see it's almost entirely overgrown by vegetation. And this temple did not used to sit on its own in the middle of a forest. This whole area would have been a city. Okay? So after people have been excluded, after smallpox had knocked people out of the area, we get this situation where the forest regrows and we have increased biodiversity after humans have been removed because they used to be the competitive dominant. Now they've been excluded, all the biodiversity comes back. However, this is not just limited to ancient societies. There are examples of it in the modern world as well. So, does anybody recognise where this is? Just have a think. Anybody know what this is? What are we looking at here? What's this image? Well, there was a very high-flying and well-received TV show done about this about a year ago. This is Chernobyl. This is Chernobyl in what used to be the Soviet Union, it's now Ukraine, immediately in the aftermath of the nuclear meltdown. So this was one of the main reactor cores of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It went absolutely gangbusters and it blew itself to pieces, and it's considered possibly the biggest accident the world's ever seen. There are two competitors for the biggest accident in the world. Chernobyl is one. The other one is the Deepwater Horizon oil well that went off in the Gulf Coast. So those two, depending on who you speak to, are both considered potentially the biggest accident in the entire world. But this is what Chernobyl looked like immediately after the nuclear meltdown. But as well as the nuclear meltdown, look at the rest of this image. So you can see this was a high-functioning, highly human-dominated landscape. We've got here's all of the infrastructure that's in place. We've got buildings everywhere. This was a huge town, Pripyat, that existed around Chernobyl. It was a very developed place indeed. So this happened, and what does Chernobyl look like now? Well, let's have a look. Give me a second, I'll just stop sharing. So, I'm just going to share my screen onto a different thing. Where is it? Okay, just pull it up. So, this is 4K drone footage taken in 2019. Shows you what Chernobyl looks like now. Okay, so here is the town. And you can see, here's all the infrastructure, but look at the amount of green trees that are growing. Everything has been reclaimed. These are old apartment buildings. But look, this was, remember, a town. All of these trees were cleared. Everything was totally cleared. Now, highly diverse again. These are tower blocks people used to live. Again, all reclaimed. There's the nuclear power plant itself in the background. You see some of these apartment blocks, you can only just see the roofs because the trees have grown so large that it's taken back over. Just let this run for about a couple of minutes. Here's the old fun fair. I mean, this was a huge developed town. There's the headquarters with the big Soviet logo still on it. This was a functioning city, effectively, in the modern world. And now it looks more like that Mayan temple, overgrown, nature's returned. go back to the other thing, stop sharing. Hello again. And we'll go back to here. Yeah, so after the nuclear meltdown that occurred in Chernobyl, people were totally excluded because nobody wants to go in and live or work or hang out in a place that is the most contaminated and most polluted place in the world. However, there's something important to remember about the type of pollution. So in Chernobyl, the contamination is radioactivities, bits of uranium and all the fun stuff that are going around. That is really, really bad for people because if you get even a mild exposure to it, it causes lung cancer and various other cancers 5 to 10, 20 years down the line. And if you get a really, really bad dose, it'll kill you very quickly. But even a mild dose is going to mean you suffer, unfortunately, very debilitating diseases years down the line. So it's a massive problem for people because we as people, we're mammals and we live a long time. Okay? We have very long life histories. We live to 80, 90, in some cases 100 years. A lot of other mammals don't live nearly that long. Their lifespan is well less than 10 years. This means even in some cases, although they're getting a dose of the radiation, they don't live long enough for it to negatively affect them. In addition, other species such as the trees, the grasses, things like that, well, they don't have lungs to get cancer, so as a result, they can survive just fine. So what we've had in Chernobyl is this incident where there's been this big, huge, enormous accident, and it's excluded people from the area. And we've been able to watch in real time nature returning. And what's crazy is that Chernobyl itself and the town of Pripyat is now a thriving ecosystem in the heart of Europe with large terrestrial mammals. One of the things that happens if you have people living in an area is you tend to lose the large terrestrial mammals. This is because we tend to either shoot them because we think they're tasty, we think they're destructive, or we think they're dangerous. But in Chernobyl, where people have now been excluded, we have things like the European bison has a large population in Chernobyl. A highly endangered species with a tiny range nowadays now has a thriving population in Chernobyl. This is because, although it's getting a dose of the radiation, its life history is not so long as ours, so it doesn't live long enough to be negatively affected. In addition, we've got large populations of wild boars going through Chernobyl. So we've got these large mammals returning to an area where people have been excluded. The biggest story is that wolves have returned. Wolves are highly excluded through most of Europe. People are a little bit nervous a lot of time about living around wolves. Europe is a high population density for people continent. It's highly developed. So wolves have been excluded through most of Europe. But in this area of Chernobyl and the surrounding city, the wolves have returned because they've been able to forage on these populations of large mammals. So it's an incredible story of people getting excluded, but in the modern era, so we can actually watch the biodiversity returning. So, just as a thought exercise, what would happen if humans were entirely lost from the Earth? Okay, I understand we're currently in a bit of a pandemic, so this might be a little bit on the nose, but the pandemic that we're suffering right now is unfortunately not as bad as it has been in previous years. So this is things like medieval imagery from the bubonic plague and the Black Death. The bubonic plague, the Black Death, killed off about a quarter to a third of the entire population of Europe. So it was pretty serious. It was caused by these little rats. But let's think about, as a thought exercise, what had happened if this had destroyed everybody? What would return? What would happen if humans were lost entirely from the Earth? And I'll just give you a minute, in fact, not that, 30 seconds to think about what species would become dominant. What would become the top species, top of the food chain? What would happen? Well, generally, we would see an increase in biodiversity. As we've seen in the Mayan temples, the Mayan cities, the Inca cities, we'd see an increase in biodiversity generally, as we saw in Chernobyl. But what species would become the sort of top predator? Well, I've got no proof of this, but it's my little idea. I think there's one species that we would expect would definitely become the top predator in these ecosystems. And we've got a few clues to this. So first of all, think about what happened in Chernobyl. So after humans were removed, the wolves returned. Now, there is one species that exists in every continent on Earth. It exists at very high densities already, and it's been shown to be incredibly adaptable. And it's a species that can become the top of food chains very, very easily. And that species is actually the same species as the wolf. It is the domestic dog. I've even got one here. Hey, buddy. So dogs exist on every continent on Earth, except Antarctica. They exist at very, very high population densities. And they've been shown that they're incredibly adaptable. So, I mean, look at the difference in genetics in dogs. So after humans were removed, as they happen a couple of times, you would expect to see dogs breeding randomly, their genetics returning back to what their wolf ancestors used to be, and they take over the place. This has happened in Australia, it happened in Chernobyl, it's even happening in smaller cases in other Russian cities where you have large populations of feral dogs. So in Moscow and things like that, you have these populations of dogs that tend to take over. So you would become literally top dog again. Hey, buddy. Okay. Let's just stop sharing. That's as far as I wanted to get to today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.